These series of lectures are an introduction to the book of Job. And there's going to be a lot of material, partly because this is the book I wrote my dissertation on, particularly the speeches of God in the book of Job. And also because Job is a very complicated and disputed book. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of detail in the book of Job. First, we want to talk about its place in the canon. At the very beginning of the course, we talked about sort of clues as to the formation of the canon of the books of the Bible that were considered authoritative. In about the 2nd century BCE, we see that he mentions the law and the prophets and the others that follow them, as well as the law and the prophets and the other books of our fathers. But there is no real detail given. There's no list. In Josephus, in the 1st century, he refers to scriptures divided into 3 parts: 5 books of the Torah, 13 books of the Nevi'im or the prophets, and 4 other books of hymns and wisdom. And we believe that Job was considered one of them. In terms of witnesses to the Hebrew text, the most complete version we have in Hebrew comes from manuscripts of the Masoretic text. This is one of those manuscripts that my own project photographed, and it's called B19A Leningrad Codex. It's about 1,000 years old, and it is not the earliest by any means, but it is the most complete. We have fragments of the book of Job from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we have some fragments from Cave 4, and there is evidence that there is already at this time a poetic arrangement. There's one series of fragments found in Qumran Cave 2, and there's also an older one that's written in the older Hebrew script. It also seems to be arranged poetically. This is interesting because it gives us very early evidence that they were arranging on the page according to the kind of literature that it was. Another important witness is the Greek Septuagint. There are some differences in the Greek. It is mostly faithful to the Masoretic text, or what we call the Proto-Masoretic text, which would have been before the Middle Ages when vowel points were added. There is some tendency to emphasize God's perfection, and it is about 400 lines shorter. You can see the chapters in which some of the lines are omitted, particularly in chapters 22 through 37. And we think that this may be that they just wanted to avoid repetition, because there is quite a lot of repetition in the book of Job. There are other Greek versions, Aquila, Theodotion, Symmachus, which are later. There are Aramaic texts. For example, in the Rabbinic Targum, these are Aramaic translations that we find in Rabbinic Bibles, and it follows the Masoretic Hebrew text closely, but it interprets some verses in the light of Israel's history and adds theological explanations. The oldest of the Aramaic Targums is 11Q10 from the Dead Sea Scrolls, somewhere between the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. And there are rather fragmentary remains from the middle of chapter 17 through 42:11. The beginning is more complete. It supports the Masoretic text, including the order of the books of 24 through 27, which are somewhat controversial among scholars. They have arguments about these chapters because the friends' dialogue seems to be sort of uh, out of order, chopped up, something like that. But we see that there are very old witnesses to the present order. There is some difference in the order of lines, sometimes a freer translation in difficult passages. For example, 38:7, when the morning stars shone, Masoretic text sang together, and all the angels, the Masoretic text has sons of God, shouted in unison. Also, there is from K4 at Qumran a fragment of an Aramaic translation of Job. The Syriac Peshitta is a later Aramaic translation of the Bible, and it was used by the Syrian Orthodox Church, a kind of Aramaic that's a little bit farther east. It is translated directly from the Hebrew and therefore offers insight into obscure words and difficult passages. The Latin text of Job was translated, at least the Vulgate version, by Jerome in the 4th century, and he worked with a rabbi to translate Job into Latin directly from the Hebrew, but he is influenced by later Greek translations as well, probably not so much by his own choice, but because they were already so well known within the church. There are some unique features of the language of Job. And here is a new phrase you can add to your vocabulary. Hapax legomena. Hapax legomena are words that occur, or forms of words sometimes that occur only once in the Bible. And it has more of these than any other book, 170 unique words, and this makes translation very difficult, particularly in the Yahweh speeches. There's a lot of really difficult passages. These are sort of masked by the choices that are made in English translations. If you go and try to figure out the actual Hebrew, it gets very, very difficult. There is unique morphology. That means spelling and the formation of words, and syntax. That's word order. The language is Hebrew, but it's very different than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. It could have perhaps been influenced by another Semitic language. There's a strong Aramaic flavor, and what we would call conservative spelling. One of the things that happened in the Semitic languages is because the alphabet is only consonantal, they developed some of those consonants to double as vowels, the equivalent to our W, Y, and H. But the book of Job does not really use those the way the rest of the Bible does. Some have suggested an Edomite setting. An Edomite would have been Transjordan in the south, sort of, east of Judah. Some have suggested that it was actually translated from another language, such as Aramaic or Arabic, but there are very few people who accept that today. But it does have many Aramaic words. It has been suggested that it could be a different dialect, or simply that you have somebody who is using a lot of literary devices. The findings of Ugaritic texts have aided in our understanding. Ugaritic is an older language that was used in the northern coast of Syria in a city called Ugarit, which was destroyed in 1200 BCE, and it is closely related to Hebrew, and so we have been able to gain some understanding from that language. One possibility is the author may have been multilingual and simply, borrowed words from other languages, particularly in parallel with Hebrew terms. Here are some examples of those hapax-legomena. These are words that we don't really know quite how to translate. In Job 3:5, let gloom and deep darkness claim it, let clouds settle upon it, let the something of the day terrify it. Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt, or is there any flavor in the juice of something? Distress and anguish terrify them. They prevail against them like a king prepared for something. His loins, some word, full of milk, and the marrow of his bones moist. The something of the rivers they probe, hidden things they bring to light. The something's wings flap wildly, though its pinions lack plumage. Here is a useful way to think about the structure of Job. And it is kind of important to think of the structure because it's a fairly complex book. And this is a suggestion of John Hartley in his Nycote commentary. You first have an introduction, and you have a heavenly scene. Then you have a heavenly scene and Job's misfortune, paralleled by a second heavenly scene and Job's physical affliction. You have an introduction of three friends, Job's curse, lament, and then a dialogue which is arranged in three cycles. The third cycle of which kind of comes to an abrupt end and seems to have things that are misplaced. There's a hymn to wisdom, Job's avowal of innocence, Job's remembrance, a lament, an oath of innocence, the Elihu speeches, and then the theophany, the appearance of God. You have Yahweh's first speech and Job's response, then Yahweh's second speech and Job's response, and then an epilogue, which includes judgment on the friends and Yahweh's blessing on Job.